So if you've been following the news, or even, dare I say it, follow me on Twitter, you might know that there's a war going on. Specifically, there are many wars going on, but the one I'm talking about is in Ukraine. There has been a lot of misinformation and I feel like I need to say something. I was working on a code video, but right now Ukraine seems a little bit more important. I'm so happy that real life is not online. It is incredible how much relief that has given me in the last couple days. Online, it seems to be a raging debate on who is in the right, Russia or Ukraine, when the answer is so obvious. And I praise the Lord every day that in real life people seem to universally be taking the correct opinion on this one. There is a clear good guy in this conflict and a clear bad guy. There are maybe some nuances, which I will touch on in this video, but in general it is so obvious who is in the right and who is in the wrong. It's Ukraine, by the way. Ukraine is in the right. And that's obvious to anyone who engages honestly with this question and who knows anything about it. So a couple days, weeks, months, years ago, depending on how fast I make this video, who knows, I don't edit very fast, Russia invaded Ukraine. They gave two justifications for that. Number one, they wanted to demilitarize Ukraine, which is stupid on its face, because Ukraine has a right to a military, and if Russia doesn't like that, well, they can get banned. And to denazify Ukraine. That one is a little bit more interesting to talk about. Russia says Ukraine is being run by Nazis right now. How true is that? Well, virtually not at all. The evidence people use for this is really weak. The only thing I've ever seen from Ukraine that really screams like Nazi is the Azov battalion, which is a Nazi battalion. Like, completely, I'm pretty sure they would even admit they are. Like, they have the swastikas, the bad, everything that's like this is a Nazi thing that they have. They have been fighting, I believe, since the beginning of the conflict in Donbass, so since 2014. And since then they have been incorporated into the broader Ukrainian military, which makes Ukraine one of the only countries in the world, if not the only country in the world, that has an official Nazi battalion, which is pretty bad. But is that enough to say the country is being run by Nazis? The Azov battalion is like 2,500 strong, out of a military of 200,000 people. So that's a little over 1%. And also, let's be honest, it is the only country honest enough to have a Nazi battalion, because if you look at the militaries of virtually every country in the world, there are some shady figures, let's just say, in there. So if you use the fact that there are Nazis fighting in the army as evidence that the country is run by Nazis, I would put money on it that every country in the world would be a Nazi country. But if you look at the prominence of Nazi ideology, or even just general far-right ideologies, you will not find that much of that in Ukraine. It exists, of course, it exists everywhere. And it's bad that it's there, but not a single seat was won by far-right parties in the Ukrainian election, which is less than most other countries with multiple parties. And the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, you might have seen him on the news recently, is a Russian-speaking Jew whose family died in the Holocaust. There are genuine problems with Ukraine. There are genuine problems with how Ukraine is run. But the fact that it's run by Nazis is just not true, not based on anything. And if Russia was this glorious bastion of progressivism, then maybe they'd have a point. Maybe they would have a right to be like, this is a bad country. But how can I say this? It doesn't. Russia calling Ukraine fascist is the clearest example of the pot calling the kettle black I've ever seen in my life. Just like how Ukraine has the Azov battalion, Russia has the Wagner group, which is also a Nazi organization. Russia used blood and soil arguments to invade Ukraine. They was like, it's Russians. Russians belong in Russia. I'm sorry, but that's ethno-nationalist rhetoric, which is pretty closely aligned with Nazi ideology. Putin showed ambition to recreate a Russian empire, which is just an imagined glorious past that he wants to recreate, which is also pretty close to fascist ideology. Russia funds almost every far-right party and group in the West and probably beyond. Like, for example, political parties, a lot of far-right parties get their money from Russia, while Russia's broader society is a class collaborationist, the same economic style of the Nazis, authoritarian, like the Nazis, and hypernationalist, also like the Nazis. So if there's one fascist country on this planet, I don't think it would be Ukraine, but maybe one of its neighbors. I've heard people also bring up that Ukraine isn't very democratic, which, I agree that it isn't very democratic, but it's definitely one step above Russia. Ukraine banned its communist parties, which is pretty bad, all things considered. But in Russia, the communist party might not be illegal, but let's be really honest with ourselves. It's not as if the communist party has any power whatsoever. What Putin says, Putin gets, and that is Russia, and you can't get around that. The communist party is controlled opposition and nothing more. And even then, even if everything I just said was wrong, even if Ukraine is a horrible Nazi country, and if Russia was an awesome democratic nation that had all the rights in the world, I'd let you in on a little secret. Far-right extremism doesn't justify imperialism. Invading countries with far-right extremism, literally the only thing that does is make that far-right extremism worse. The best way to throw fuel on the fire that Russia is destroying your country is invading that country if you're Russia. Because if you do that, the only thing that the Nazis have to do is, look, they're invading. I told you they'd be bad. And then the people are like, oh yeah, well I guess you're right. The same happened in the Islamic world. You have the Taliban, you have Hamas, you have Al-Qaeda, you have ISIS. All those organizations only exist because those countries have been fucked over by foreign powers. The war on terror has not been effective, and starting a war on terror in Ukraine wouldn't be effective either. Really the only thing that would justify invading another country is if they were doing a genocide. And guess what? Russia says Ukraine is doing it. And if they are, more power to Russia, I guess. Then Russia is being a good boy. So what's this genocide they're talking about? Ukraine banned Russian as an official language, so you can't use it in official transactions anymore. So you can do it in stores, not in government things. That's it. That's literally all I've heard. There are also people who say that Ukraine was fighting a war in Donbass and dropping bombs on a majority Russian population is a sign of genocide, but that's just a war. Just because you fight in an area that's majority one ethnicity doesn't mean you're committing genocide against that ethnicity. So the making it not an official language anymore is the closest thing to a genocide Ukraine is doing. But is that a genocide though? Not really. Maybe a little if you squint at it. It kind of maybe fits in the definition of trying to destroy in whole or in part a certain group, but not really. The fact that they didn't make it an official language anymore is bad. It's very bad. That's probably one of the worst things Ukraine did. Okay? And it's worthy of condemnation all the way through. You know what that doesn't justify? Invading it and killing tens of thousands, if not more people. Ukraine should be pressured to reinstate Russian as an official language. But beyond that, Russia should shut the fuck up and fuck off. And also, if you want a genocide to happen against a discriminated against minority, it is invading that country. That is how you get ethno-nationalism. That is how you get genocidal behavior. Especially if you are the same ethnicity as the people that are at risk of a genocide. Because then people will just, oh, it's the Russians, we should fight the Russians. And then they fight the Russians also, not just the army, but also the people that are not in the army. But so far, thankfully, Ukraine hasn't gone down that route. So far, the narrative that Ukraine has used is the coming together of liberal democracies in order to fight a fascist country. Thank everyone except Putin for going in that direction. But that is not a narrative that naturally follows from being invaded. Usually the narrative becomes, this ethnicity is bad, this group, this country, this thing deserves to die now. Another justification that Russia gives for the invasion is that it says that the current Ukrainian government that was installed after the Euromaidan revolution, that it's not legitimate, that it wasn't a real revolution, that it was actually a Western coup. All the signs that it is a grassroots movement, aka a movement that is supported by the people and brought about by the people, are there. Every single election since that revolution has reinstated that revolution as being the will of the people. The pro-Russia side doesn't win anymore. It's always the more pro-Western side. And that's mostly because Russia sucks and Ukraine thinks Russia sucks. The pro-Russian Ukrainian government also sucked. The revolution was brought about because first there were peaceful protests because the Ukrainian government decided to pivot from the West back to Russia, and it became very large. And what was the pro-Russian government's response? Shooting. killing the protesters and passing laws that virtually made protesting illegal. That is what its response was. And in response to that, the people overthrew the government. And I believe that the people have a right and that it's good, actually, to overthrow authoritarian governments as the people of that country. Some people might say, but that you gotta do it within a system. No, shut the fuck up, liberal, bitch. If the government sucks, you have a right to overthrow it. Because the government is there supposed to be for the people. And if the government isn't there for the people anymore, the government got to go. Pro-democracy, pro-civil rights protests and revolutions are good. Actually, people will use the fact that there was Western involvement in the revolution as evidence that it was just a Western-backed coup. Even though there was some Western involvement, if this is how the West is gonna practice imperialism from now on by backing grassroots pro-democracy movements, then I don't really care. Some people say, how do you know it's grassroots movement, even though every election since then has been in favor of this movement, but the most pro-Russian sides haven't been able to vote. What? They haven't been able to vote? Yes, that's right, because Russia is occupying those territories and you can't vote in a territory that's occupied by a different country. Mind blown, right? Like Donbass couldn't vote because it's controlled by Russia, and the Crimea also couldn't vote because it's also controlled by Russia. Even more so. But if they could vote, would that mean that Ukraine would suddenly be going the different direction? No, that is not what that would mean. Zelensky, the current president of Ukraine, won by 70% of the vote. So even if every single person in Donbass and Crimea voted against him, he would still have won easily, unless you're telling me that they have like half the population of Ukraine. And also not even to mention that Zelensky's appeal was in the east, not the West. The Western areas are literally the only areas that voted against him. So they probably would have voted for Zelensky too. But details, who cares, right? But notice how these weren't the things Russia was talking about before the invasion happened. Before the invasion happened, Russia really cared only about one thing. Not the Nazis, not the government really that much, not the genocide, none of them. The only thing Russia cared about was NATO. Because that is the only thing Russia in reality cares about. And everything else they say is a weak-ass excuse to justify something that's unjustifiable. You can say, but not. NATO is bad. And I would say, okay, great, you can believe that. Ukraine doesn't believe that. And Ukraine is the only one whose opinion matters on whether or not Ukraine should join NATO. Because I am fundamentally anti-imperialist, I believe that no country is entitled to a sphere of influence. Not the United States, not China, and not Russia. No one is. If you want countries in your sphere of influence, what you need is to convince them to join your sphere of influence voluntarily. Call it the free marketplace of alliances or whatever. Every country has a right to choose their own future. And if Russia doesn't like Ukraine joining NATO, you know what Russia should do? Offer a better deal than the US is offering. That's how you keep Ukraine out of NATO without invading, without war. But the problem is, Russia can't do it. Russia sucks. Russia doesn't want to have an equal partnership with Ukraine. Russia wants to dominate Ukraine. The only reason Ukraine wants to join NATO in the first place is because Russia sucks. Russia gives them nothing. Russia only brings pain to Ukraine. So why in the world would Ukraine be like, you know what? I like Russia. Let's stay with Russia. People are saying Ukraine should stay a neutral buffer zone between Russia and the United States to avoid war. At first glance that might sound reasonable. Because war is bad, obviously. But they forget that a buffer state is a deeply unethical thing to force a country to be. If a country doesn't want to be a buffer state, they shouldn't have to be a buffer state. The only thing that should matter for what a country will become is the opinion of the people in that country. You might say, but no, that is highly unrealistic. You know what? None of my politics are realistic. I don't give a fuck if it's realistic. The thing I care about is what's right. You should advocate for the things that are right, that are good. Because, I'm a socialist. Socialism isn't really realistic in my lifetime. I'm a world federalist. The world uniting into a single country is also not very realistic. But I advocate for those things because I think those are good ideas and they should fight for it. Just like how anti-imperialism is unrealistic, but you should fight for it anyway. Even if imperialism isn't being committed by someone who is not the United States. Russia is imperialist. Don't let anyone on the internet convince you that it's not. Just because Russia doesn't have the power to control the entire world like the United States doesn't mean that Russia doesn't explicitly use imperialism to influence the countries that surround it. But unlike the US that use mostly economic power, even China uses mostly economic power, Russia uses military power because it has nothing else. And every country that doesn't kowtow to Russian interests gets invaded. Look, bordering Russia, okay? Every country that borders or is in the area of Russia. Every country that's not either NATO or hard under the Russian thumb. Every country, except for Sweden and Finland, gets invaded or destabilized in some way. Look at Ukraine. Twice now. Moldova has a separatist territory funded by Russia, and Georgia has too. Why? Because those countries decided that they might not want to stay with Russia. They haven't even decided fully yet to go with the West. They just thought about it. And Russia's response is to fuck those countries. Russia says that it's scared of a NATO invasion, because if Ukraine joined NATO, it would be a lot easier for NATO to invade Russia. I want you to think about it for literally a second. When is NATO going to invade Russia? Seriously, what would cause NATO to invade Russia? Because if you don't know, Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal of any country in the world. Invading Russia would kill everyone in the world. The entire world could be in NATO, and NATO would still not invade Russia. There's no timeline, except in the timeline where we all die, where NATO invades Russia. So that is a bullshit excuse, and I think the elites in Russia know this because they're not stupid. It's really about Russia wanting to maintain control over its neighbors. That is the real reason they're doing this. Russia wants to keep its grip tight around Europe as hard as possible, and it needs to squeeze hard because if it lets go even a little, Europe will immediately run away. Russia mainly uses its natural gas export as a way to keep influencing Europe. And guess what? What they discovered in Ukraine recently? A shit ton of natural gas. Enough to make Europe no longer as dependent on Russia. So maybe that is part of the reason these things are happening. This conflict is on Russia. Not Ukraine, not NATO, nobody else, except Russia. Not even Russia. On Putin. Nobody wants this war except for Putin. Not the Russian people, not the Ukrainian people, not even really the Russian elite want this war. The West doesn't want this war. Nobody does except for Putin. Because he realizes that his country is slowly dying and he wants to do a last-ditch effort to keep control over his dying empire. People are for some reason blaming this on NATO. That because NATO was like, hey Ukraine, if you want, you can join us. And then Ukraine was like, okay, cool, I'll think about it. And then Russia's response was, no you're not. I'm sorry, but that is not an adequate response to that. Also, people were saying that NATO was beating the war drums before this happened and that's why Russia invaded, which is lunacy. NATO and the United States and everyone else was like, hey, Russia, if you invade, you're gonna get sanctioned, so don't do it. I'm sorry, but that is de-escalation. If you're like, hey, don't do war because otherwise we'll get mad at you, a country should respond to that okay, well I didn't want this war anyway, so I'm not gonna do it. It would have been fine if Russia just didn't invade. There wouldn't have been sanctions, nothing would have happened, except probably worsened relations with Ukraine, which, to be fair, they were already going down that path. And if you're here yeah, but Ukraine is bad too, yes, Ukraine is also bad. Ukraine has many flaws. Ukraine is far from being a country which I would consider to be based. But both sides in here only helps Russia. Saying I don't support any government, I support the people. If you really support the people, you will support Ukraine in its struggle against Russia. Standing on the side of the people means standing on the side of Ukraine. If Russia stops fighting, there will be no war. If Ukraine stops fighting, there will be no more Ukraine. If you want this war to end, you gotta put pressure on Russia to stop this war. Just like how it would have been silly to tell the Iraqis when the US invaded to be like, hey Iraqis, just stop fighting. No, the US should just fuck off. And in this case, the Russians should fuck off. It's that simple. So Putin, I know you're watching this. Can you please go away? Can you please stop? Thank you.